district did a lot. Now, someone asked about African Americans. I'll also tell you that in the book, I make it clear, right, that the district was not perfect. And I start the chapter that way. It's my chapter number 4. I call it Betraying the Cause. Because one of the things that I learned when I did this research is that this district, like every other district, segregated its African American population. I mean, this district was founded so that its students would not be segregated in a white-controlled school system, but yet here they are segregating their African American students. That population was small, maybe about 17, the highest at any given year prior to 1956. And I do say 1956, not 1954. Because even after 54, school districts continued to segregate. Hell, HISD segregated all the way to 1970 after 1954. And so here I call it Betraying the Cause because the district had an opportunity to really be a truly egalitarian school system where brown, black, and even white students who attended this school system could share classrooms equally and share that space equally, and the district dropped the ball. They subscribed to anti-blackness and they subscribed to those same kinds of prejudices that was being forced onto them from Austin and those kinds of things. And so African Americans suffered in this school system and they struggled in this school system. The black students of San Felipe went to a black school that they call Langston Elementary. You can see the Langston school sign there. It was named after Langston Hughes. And the school was managed by African Americans, parents, the teachers that they would hire. Miss Frances Thomas was the last teacher who taught at that school, a woman out of San Antonio who was recruited to come move to West Texas to come and teach these pupils. She taught there for about 3.5 years. And then in 1956, they integrated. And so that school went away and all the African American students were then populated throughout the Mexican American school system. And while they were in the same school system, when I interviewed them, because I interviewed like 9 students, 9 alumni from this school, they talked to me about the struggles that they encountered and experienced when they had to attend different schools. Different schools with different students and different teachers. And where was Miss Thompson? That's who our teacher was. Where is she? Well, she stuck around for about 1.5 years, and they didn't renew her contract, and she went back to San Antonio. And so, so they struggled, right? No one ever talks about sort of the poverty of progress of integration. We recognize integration to be an achievement of civil rights, and certainly it is, but there's problems that come with that sometimes at the very most intimate levels, and a lot of these students certainly revealed that. But over time, these black students begin to thrive. They begin to find themselves and find ways to navigate through the district. Then they begin to excel, and then they begin to shine like never before. This is a picture of Sid Blanks. Sid Blanks was attended the Langston School and then was integrated and then graduated from the high school in 1960. He becomes the first of 2 African Americans to graduate from San Felipe ISD. The year is 1960. And Sid Blanks was a stellar athlete. He was their star running back on the football team. He ran track, played baseball, he did it all. Right? And then he goes to college. He goes to college in South Texas at Texas A&M Keansville today, but I think it was called Texas A&M back then. And he's a stellar football player then. And then he's recruited to play for the Houston Oilers, and he lived a great part of his life here in Houston. That's Sid Blanks. And so they began to shine and really excel like never before. Now this district isn't there anymore. In 1971, the federal government forced this school system, San Felipe ISD, to consolidate with the neighboring school system also in Del Rio. The city of Del Rio had 2 school districts, Del Rio ISD, which is overwhelmingly white, and San Felipe ISD, which is overwhelmingly Mexican American, 95% Chicano. And so in 1971, the federal government, the federal courts specifically, are taking the reins on integration. Because what's happening after Mendez in 47, after Delgado in 48, and after Brown in 54, school districts are still not integrated. HISD, Dallas ISD, Beaumont ISD, I mean, you name it. They are not integrated. They are finding ways to delay the orders, or they're finding ways to circumvent the orders. Like HISD, for example, would put Chicanos and blacks in the same schools and then use the legal classification of Mexican Americans as Caucasian and call that integration. We've integrated Caucasians and African Americans, leave us alone, federal government. That's what they were doing since 1954. So the federal judge says, no more. We know what you're doing, enough is enough. We are now gonna force you to integrate by way of consolidation when you ask 2 districts to join together. And that's what happens in 1971 through this court case when the federal government is taking the reins on integration. Now, this is to achieve integration. And again, right, integration is a civil rights achievement. It is a civil rights act. But again, in this case, integration is going to have the reverse effect, specifically on the population under investigation. Because Mexican Americans refused to consolidate. They refused to combine their schools and classrooms and their kids with their rivals, Del Rio ISD, for a whole host of reasons that I won't get into now, because I want to make sure we have time for everybody else. But it causes problems. And now, as teachers, right, teachers have not problems with each other. They now have to sort of deal with each other within the confines of a singular school district. Teachers are fighting. They're fighting over positions. They're fighting over pay. Hell, they're fighting over parking spaces. They're fighting over everything, these teachers are. The administrators are fighting. And then even students are fighting. Students also find it difficult to adjust to the new mandate, and then they become unruly. I use the word unruly. And right, you can see here, oh, let me get to the next slide. You can see here that students begin to engage in physical altercations. That's not a dance in the gym. That's a pep rally that turned into a mini riot. When Mexicans and whites don't know how to get along, they end up fighting each other. For about 2 weeks this happened. This is week 1 of the first school year, 1971. And that happened for about 2 weeks. And so law enforcement is patrolling all the classrooms and all the schools, wherever the schools exist. And you have, Del Rio's a border town community. It already had a lot of law enforcement. You got Border Patrol, you got state troopers, you got sheriff, you got Del Rio PD, and now you have more as a result of this. And so the other kinds of problems is consolidation is going to open up another can of worms, because what's going to happen is consolidation was supposed to be an equal, even Steven merger. That's not what happened. Del Rio was always the larger district. It was the more affluent district, and it was a district, right? They were the district that was under a system that was designed to benefit them. So they become the leaders of the new consolidated district. Like, that superintendent stays that superintendent. That principal stays that principal, and so on and so on. And then what they begin to do is they begin to systematically destroy the history and the identity of San Felipe. They're removing structures. They're destroying memorabilia, from trophies to yearbooks to, what do you call the jerseys, the sweaters with the letter on it? Letterman jackets and sweaters and those. They're destroying everything. All the accomplishments that this community had achieved since 1929, and then since 1930, and then since 1932, those things are into the incinerator. They're even removing structures. Like, they used to have a museum, not a museum, they used to have an auditorium. Beautiful wood trim auditorium that served as a museum by itself, because they would have the walls would be adorned with photos and memorabilia that spoke to the history of that community. That structure was removed and destroyed. They also removed and destroyed a stadium, a memorial stadium built in the 1940s and 50s, dedicated to veterans of the Second World War.
So you say they, that government?
No, the officials from Del Rio ISD, Anglo officials, white officials from Del Rio ISD. And this structure was removed too, in its place as a parking lot. That's where I parked when I went to go do my research on the parking lot, where that stadium once stood. And so this is what integration achieved for this community. It had the opposite effect, where black and brown people in San Antonio and Dallas and Houston were celebrating and clapping hands and high-fiving integration. Here in Del Rio, right? They're crying they're crying into their pillows and those kinds of things. Now know also that the community is going to fight back. For starters, right, they're going to position themselves to become the new leaders of the district. They vie for positions and that kind of stuff, and they do that effectively. They re-steer the curriculum. They try to remove all the curriculum that was trying to make sure that these kids went to college. They try to put them in vocational classes, put them in remedial classes. They challenged that successfully as well. But then what they also did is they stopped the further demolition of their buildings. No more destroying our buildings. Then they also began to rename campuses after leaders and teachers from that former district. So now that schools, right, it's not school number 1 or school number 2. Now it's named after Irene Cárdenas, right, a longtime teacher in that community. Then the other thing that they did is they founded a museum, right? They call it the Memorial Center, but it's really a museum. It sits right there in the heart of the community, and it houses the most extensive collection of artifacts dedicated to the history of this community. And it's through this facility that I was able to write this book. What I also use is I use interviews, oral histories. It's my bread and butter. I start everything with oral histories. I bring it into the classroom. If you have me as an instructor, you already did oral histories. And I interviewed 43 persons for this project. who at one time were students, teachers, or parents who sustained the school, or who taught on them, or who went to them. And what I got was a diverse spectrum of sort of the triumphs and tragedies of the one-of-a-kind school system that is San Felipe ISD. And so I end the book, and I end the study in 1971, really in 1980. And I ended on a sour note, but I make it clear to the reader that this is not a story of defeat, but this is a story of resistance, if anything. And I make it known to the reader, and you can find this book on Amazon if you're okay from buying from Amazon. Our library has the book as well. It's got two copies of it. But I make it clear to the reader that this is a story of resistance. This is a story of fighting back. This is a story of resilience and insurgence. That Mexican Americans and Chicanos did not just stand idly by and allow the things that bedeviled them to continue to bedevil them. They fought back. With whatever resources they had, they fought back. And this spirit of resistance doesn't emerge after World War II. This spirit of resistance doesn't happen during the Chicano movement of later years. This spirit of resistance is centuries old, since before the 1900s, since before 1848, since before 1836. That spirit of resistance was there. And then I'll also tell the reader that this spirit of resistance, right, I use phrases like the spectrum of resistance, meaning that Mexican Americans and Chicanos use several ways, right, resisted in several ways. They used the courts, right, they lobbied, they engaged in protest politics, and they also founded their own institutions, like San Felipe ISD.
That reminds me, we in class, the British and the colonists, and they fought back. Resistance,
That's resistance, yeah, resistance, right, very good.
1772.
Very good, resistance, right? So this is what this story is. This is a story of resistance, and I think that's a great transition from me to the next presenter, because I think the theme there is also resistance. So I thank you for your time. I look forward to your questions.
Excellent.
Good afternoon, everyone.
Good afternoon.
My name is Dr. Tamiko Meeks. Dr. Vincent introduced me, and I teach history here at Texas Southern. And today I want to share a portion of my work from a larger project, my dissertation. The title of my dissertation was Silent Resistance: Enslaved Girls, Poison, and the Politics of Survival, looking from 1820 to 1860. And so my talk today explores how we might recover the lives, the choices, and resistance strategies of enslaved girls. Those often silenced by the historical record, and by extension, I'm looking to reimagine the archive itself as a site of justice. And I had to really grapple with and confront a monumental challenge when I was working on my dissertation, that the archives rarely speak in the favor of Black people, especially Black women. Their presence is fragmentary, embedded in legal trials, medical records, runaway ads, and plantation ledgers, almost always mediated by the voice of their white oppressors. And so the question that I pose today is this: how do we create an archival methodology that not only finds these girls, but fully human? The work is about centering enslaved girls and also free Black girls whose lives expand our understanding of what freedom itself means. So I want to begin by addressing the limitations of what historians call the traditional archive. Mainstream archives in the United States, whether at the state level, in university special collections, or in digital repositories, have historically privileged the voices of literate white elite males. And these institutions preserve the records of power, and they do that through the law, estate inventories, court decisions, plantation ledgers, correspondence between plantation owners, and within those documents, enslaved girls often appear only as unnamed laborers, objects of sale or sources of trouble. And so my work asked the question, how do we read beyond what these moments give us to recover care, kinship, and creativity as a form of survival, as a form of resistance? So for instance, one of the cases that I looked at was State versus Ann. This is in 1850. Remember, I'm looking at 1820 to 1860. This was a case in Mississippi where I examined Ann, who was a teenage enslaved girl. And I'm gonna get into that more because a lot of the work that I looked at on my dissertation was calling these females women, and they're not women, they're girls, right? She was tried for allegedly poisoning her enslaver's family. And the court records her identity as only the girl Ann, meaning she was a possession. There was no age that was listed. I had to dig and dig and dig to find that. There was no family connection. There were no words that she spoke. Yet her actions told a story of resistance. So in reading these records, I had to resist the archive's violence, the way it erases identity, humanity, and context, to try to recover Ann's story. I had to ask different questions. What did it mean that poison was her weapon of choice? What conditions led this young girl to make that decision to use poison? And how might her silence itself be a type of strategy? So to address these silences, I use what I call an archival methodology of refusal and reclamation. Refusal is about rejecting the notion that enslaved girls are voiceless simply because their words are not recorded. It means resisting the archive's demand for corroboration, literacy, or adult personhood as a prerequisite for historical validity. Reclamation, meanwhile, involves rereading the archive against what scholars call the brain, reassembling the fragments in ways that center enslaved girls' interiority and agency. And so my methodology draws inspiration from scholars like Sadia Hartman and Marissa Fuentes, who advocate for something called critical fabulation, or a redressing of archival violence, which supposes, I say, a type of Black feminist speculation. And I use these strategies to shift the archive from a site of extraction to a site of ethical interpretation. And I consider silence not as just absence, but as deliberate refusal. And in these spaces of quiet, this is where we see strategies of endurance and even joy. Another one of the cases that I looked at, and this is 1827, was Maria. And I have two cases. One is Maria and one is Charity. And Maria was enslaved in Delaware in 1827. She was accused of attempting to burn down, and I know I said I worked on poison, but she was accused of burning down the Prettyman family home. She was owned by a man named Louis Prettyman.
How old was
She was 16. And the only source available was this very brief court document that you can see here, and a summary in a local newspaper. But the way that I recreated her story is I used surrounding information and surrounding data. So I had Maria's age, I looked at Delaware's slave demographics and records of similar accounts in the area. And I reconstructed a broader picture of her world, a world where young girls retaliated against abuse using domestic knowledge of fire, poison, and subversion. And the reason why she gets into my dissertation is because she was sold to the Prettymans, because in the court record, Prettyman found out that she had poisoned her previous owner. And he said, if I would have known that, I would have never purchased her, okay? And so what did I do with these fragments? I had to read them differently. I had to recognize not just what was written, but what was withheld. So something that was withheld, for example, when he bought her, like I said, he didn't know that she had poisoned her previous master. And I understood the archive as a structure shaped by violence and by absence, and that these absences are historically meaningful. They told me about the strategies girls use to protect themselves, about the dangers that they face when they disrupted power, and about the selective memory of a system that recorded Black girlhood only when Black girls posed a threat. And so this was foundational. This was a foundational challenge of my work, to try to turn the archive from a site of extraction, because as historians, that's what we do, we extract. But also, I wanted to use it as a site of ethical interpretation, to treat even the smallest trace of evidence, like a name in a court record or a line in a newspaper, not as an endpoint, but as an entry point to larger questions. What did survival and protection look like for enslaved girls? What forms did resistance take? And how could I tell their stories, this is important, without reproducing the violence that initially erased them? This was, I would say, as my daughter says, the case that had me in a chokehold. This was the most haunting case. Charity was very young, and there's discrepancy about how old she is. I land on 12 because that's what most newspapers were reporting, but some records say she was either between the age of 8 to 12, so she's young, she's very young. And she was in Louisville, Kentucky, and this is 1858, and she was accused of poisoning the Polk family. This was a pretty prominent family. The father was a member of the federal government, but he dies very early on, and so she ends up living with his wife and one of their daughters and her husband. She was accused of poisoning the Polk family, and her case was pretty interesting because a young slave boy heard her. He was walking down the street and he heard her one afternoon just screaming bloody murder. And so he comes back a few days later and he asked her, he was like, what's going on? And she said, well, my family beats me. He said, oh, well, poison. And so he gives her the money to go to the apothecary, which was literally across the street from their house, to buy the poison. And then there's all sorts of things sort of wrapped up in that, because the law of the day, enslaved people could not go to an apothecary. An apothecary is a pharmacy, and purchase poison. If you were going to do that, you had to, I'm sorry.
How did the young boy go again?
He didn't. He was just giving her an option to solve her problem, right? And so the day that she goes to the apothecary with the money, the pharmacist helper, who was also young, was a young white boy, he says, well, I can't sell this to you. You need a note from your enslaver. So she pretends to go back home, and then she comes right back and she says, well, my mistress is busy, and she said, you know me, give me the poison. So he gave her the poison. So she ends up going back and cooking breakfast, because this was her job, right? She was one of 2 enslaved people in the home. This is another unique thing. She's in Louisville, but she lives in the city. She's not living out in the countryside, right? And so I tried to trace who her family was, to try to figure out, like, why is she the only female? Why is she so young doing all of this domestic work, right, in this house? But she was responsible for taking care of the family, cooking their meals, so she cooks their breakfast and she poisons the coffee, okay? And he also told her, and this is all in the newspaper. Like, I know you're probably wondering how do you go out. It was all reported in the newspaper. He had told her, when you see them start to vomit, run. And she does exactly that. She runs. When the police catch up with her, she's like almost at the border of Louisville going into the next city. But they ultimately catch her. Now, the Polk household, I told you that they fell ill after they consumed the coffee. The doctor is called in, and another part of my dissertation is around toxicology, because toxicology in the United States really becomes a field because of poison use that was occurring in the slave population, because white people were terrified out of their minds about being poisoned. And so a lot of times doctors didn't know if someone was being poisoned, because poison mimics other things, right? Then I have another chapter about misattribution. But anyway, the doctor comes in and he examines them and he finds traces of arsenic. And arsenic is what she had purchased. Okay, so Charity is arrested, she's tried, and then her story stops. So then I have to do the speculation about what happens to her. And so this is where the law becomes important, because laws were being written to criminalize the black body. And poison was a capital offense. And so typically, if you poison someone and you were convicted, what do you think happened to you?
Death.
You died. So I don't know, I'm speculating, because there's no trace of Charity after this. I could not find where she was sold to another family or anything. So my speculation is that she was killed as a result. Okay. So Charity's story then underscores the fear that surrounded black girls who lived and worked in white homes. She worked in the kitchen, she handled the food, she moved through private spaces, and when illness struck, of course, she became the obvious suspect. Now, granted, she finally admits that she did this, but the archival record positioned the Pope family as extremely fearful of Charity. When they are interviewed, they tell the police, we have no idea why she did this. We loved her, we took care of her, but there is a whole account of you all beating her out in public. I don't know how much you care about it, but anyway. Their fear was rooted in the intimate relationship she had with the family. They feared her betrayal, and they also feared the special knowledge that she had of how to use poison. And Charity, in that fear, we see the logic then of the archive, because it records enslaved girls only, again, when they threaten the boundaries of white order. Now, what did this case reveal to me? First, it revealed that enslaved girls were seen only when they broke the rules. The archive is not neutral. It is shaped by surveillance, suspicion, and punishment. Second, that resistance often left the faintest traces, because all I ever saw was an accusation, a name, maybe, a charge, sometimes the age. And third, that silence in the archive does not mean silence in life. These girls may not have been recorded speaking, but they acted, and so that's not silence. And those choices, although they were dangerous, desperate, and courageous, must be read with care. So in my work, I do not treat these records as complete truths. I treat them as fragments of a very violent system. But within them, I'm also looking for possibilities, for what Saidiya Hartman calls critical fabulation, a method of reimagining, not lying, but reimagining the lives of the disappeared. So I asked, what does it mean, again, that poison was used repeatedly by young girls in domestic spaces? What does it mean that so many of them are voiceless in legal records, but present in patterns of resistance? And what can we learn from what the archive was trying to suppress? So reading those stories, and this is hard work when you're writing about things that are very violent. It's taxing on you. What it did was it helped me. And I hope that it will also help students understand that we have to reclaim something that the archive refuses to give us. Black girlhood as a site of thought, because I try to position them as intellectuals. Because there was something in my mind very unique going on. You have to be very methodical, and you have to understand dosing if you are going to poison someone. Because a lot of times, the poisoning was not quick. They would poison you over a long period of time. And so you have to know how much to give somebody to not kill them instantly. And so, think about it. If you're really trying to stick it to somebody, poisoning is the way to go. And a lot of scholars sort of read poisoning as a weapon of the weak. I use James C. Scott as sort of my framework, and he talks about weapons of the weak. And poison is a tool that men most likely would not use because it's seen as being weak. Men are gonna engage in hand-to-hand combat. But I'm telling you, using poison is not a weapon of the weak. It takes a strong person to engage in the use of poison, because you can easily poison yourself, right? And so, the very fact that these black girls and women were feared, they were punished, and remembered only in crisis, to me is evidence of their agency. Which a lot of times, if you understand history, agency is taken away from black women. And so the archive renders them visible only in punishment, and my task is to reclaim their personhood.
I think she's great.
Very courageous. All of them. All of the women, all of the girls that I looked at, very courageous. So to build an archive that centers enslaved girls and women, we must first expand our understanding of what actually counts as a record. We must move beyond the idea that only formal, state-sanctioned, or fully legible texts are worthy of historical record. Instead, we have to look in the margins, the overlooked, the fragmentary, the emotional spaces, and the domestic spaces, as places where enslaved girls left their traces. So, what did I do in my research? I engaged a range of sources that are often considered peripheral or secondary to the traditional historiography, but are central when understanding and studying black girlhood and resistance. I looked at court transcripts. These were foundational. And I looked at medical journals. Remember that I said that toxicology is becoming a field, right? And there is a whole reason why. So if we look prior to 1820, the way that poison worked, most people use plants.
Yeah.
So things like Jamestown, right? But by 1820, across the world, there was this rodent infestation that was happening. And so Europe has a whole field of toxicology, but the US does not. And we start, in the US, start using arsenic and rat's bane to try to control the rodent population, okay? And I told you I had a chapter in my dissertation about misattribution, because yes, enslaved individuals were poisoning their masters, but white people were poisoning themselves.
Yeah.
Because they used arsenic in their homes. Arsenic was in paint, it was in makeup, it was in your clothes. And so the easiest thing though is to blame the enslaved person that is working in your home. Okay? So those medical journals were very important. Runaway ads, this is really where I started, because I started looking at historical newspapers, and runaway ads are interesting because what they give are just like little descriptions, and you start to see these patterns where if you describe a girl or a woman as sassy or quiet or too bold, understand that those are code words. They're code words meaning that she's resistant. and that she's a problem. Okay? I looked at probate records, church registers, all of these things to help me build out this non-traditional, if you will, archive. And these sources are often dismissed by formal historians as anecdotal or unverified, but they provided me with a rich source of intergenerational knowledge and helped me understand cultural survival. Now, I've been talking about building community archives. This is really important to me, and I do a lot of work around this. And so using family Bibles, Family Search, which is a database connected to Ancestry, was very important because one of the cases that I looked at that I was able to get a lot of information. I looked at family letters, family Bibles, and they were literally writing about everything, every aspect of their lives. I looked at letters that were going back and forth between sisters for one of my cases. And also I looked at Black churches because Black churches become sites of memory preservation. Okay? Now I want to ask you all a question. Who are the memory keepers in your family or your community? And what materials or stories might already be a part of your archive, even if no one has named it an archive yet? Because those things are going to become important to telling your stories, right, in the future. Now, when working with archival records about enslaved girls, ethical interpretation is not just a methodological choice, it's a moral obligation. So again, I told you that my dissertation had me in a chokehold and kept me up at night because the stakes were high. I had to figure out how to read, how to represent, and how to tell their stories in a way not to re-inscribe harm, but to fully do justice for these girls and to repair the harm that had already been done. And so understand that I had to acknowledge the violence without sensationalizing the violence, because that's what historical newspapers did. They would sensationalize these things that Black girls were doing, right? I also had to recognize absence as meaningful. Absence in the archive, again, is not a void, it is a consequence of structural violence. And I worked to center the girl's humanity, not just her punishment, because that's what the court records did. They focused on her punishment, right? There was one case that I worked on in Tennessee. The girl's name was Ann. Her owner's father had like hundreds of slaves, and he had willed them to 10 of his children. They all each got so many, but his girls, he told in the will that you could never resell any of these enslaved people. You had to keep them together. But when Anne poisoned her master's baby and was convicted of it, the first thing that the owner wants to do is sell her. And they go to court, and the court grants, against what the will says, the court grants the sale. So my guiding question was, when I read a record of enslaved girls' acts and subsequent punishment, what would it mean to narrate her life backward, from the moment of violence to the life that came before it? Because remember, I wasn't working with a lot of information. I had to use the sources that were available to me to recreate their lives. So I felt like it's my responsibility to witness without re-inflicting harm. I needed to describe the violence, and understanding that me describing it is not the same as dignifying the victim, right? The victim meaning the white person. The aim was to return personhood to narrate backwards. And so, if I were to give a project like this to my students, I would ask, from the act of resistance, you need to think about the life that made the resistance possible. What was happening to that enslaved girl that made her want to act? So, in conclusion, to recover the lives and resistance practices of enslaved girls, it is not merely an academic exercise. This is an act of justice. We talk about social justice all the time. This is an act of justice. It demands that we interrogate not just what the archive holds, but what it excludes, what it distorts, and what it forgets. And in the words of Marissa Fuentes, the archive is the site of racial and gendered violence. But again, it's a site of possibility. Through an intentional, ethical methodology, one that centers refusal, reclamation, and community, we can begin to restore personhood to those who were denied it in life and in the record. And as I close, my belief that my work on recovering resistance, on recovering Black girlhood itself, is a sort of second awakening. Each rediscovered story redefines resistance and freedom, and it expands the moral archive of this nation. And so the question then is not who is unknowable, but who becomes knowable when we commit to remembering history differently. Thank you.
I want to thank you, COLABS and the university for having me here as a part of this. So there's a theme of resistance that's been brought up by both Dr. Sparson and Dr. Eaton that's going to continue with my presentation too. Also want to sort of at the outset here deal with some of the type of sources I had to use to do the digging to find the things that I discovered, right? And so resistance is difficult to find in the historical record, right? Except in the court systems. You find it plenty of times there. So court documents will prove to be very suitable for this kind of work, right? But there were times because some of the disruptors that I learned about disrupted the state. There were times you could find documentation of their resistance in government records and letters between powerful people describing the situation that they face, right? And the history that I'm looking at goes back a little bit farther back in time. I'm dealing largely with mid to late 18th century, going into the early 19th century. And so our presentation here is called Landscapes of Resistance and Environmental History of Slavery, because I want to step back and take a sort of broader look at slave resistance. One of the things that I do in my classes when teaching either U.S. or African American history, and when we get to the part about slavery, is to ask students about what forms of slave resistance that they're aware of, right? And inevitably, people usually will talk about slave revolts and rebellions, right? They'll talk about Nat Turner or Mark Vesey or the Stonewall Revolt, that sort of thing, right? Some people may mention aspects of running away, right? Those are some of the more commonly understood and openly seen acts of resistance, right? But I do want to include those in this presentation, but I also want to just touch on the fact that there's an environmental aspect of resistance, right? There's an environmental aspect of slavery itself, right? Because the environment is involved in anything that we as humans do, including right here in the 21st century, right? We have a conflict going on right now where geography and environment plays a part, right? The Strait of Hormuz and what's going to be the outcome of that. So what is environmental history, right? So environmental history, just to use Richard Shephash's definition, is an interdisciplinary field that examines the dynamic relationship between humans and the natural world over time, right? It investigates how the environment influences human societies and vice versa, highlighting the reciprocal effects between human actions and environmental changes. Now, how does this apply to slavery, right? Slavery, like any action, involves some relationship to the environment. And when we talk about the colonial Atlantic world, which would include the region I studied, Brazil, right, but also the larger Atlantic world to include the United States, and I'll be making parallels to the U.S. Throughout this, right? To be involved in the traffic of slavery, to be involved in the labor and production of slavery, is to be involved in some environmental relationship, right? And usually an extractive one. And when we look at slavery, we have to acknowledge that the relationship to the local environment is going to differ between looking at the plantation owners, the slave owners themselves, right, and the enslaved, right? Because the slave owner, the plantation owner, has an extractive relationship with that environment, right? They are looking to grow the sugar cane, to grow the cotton, to grow the indigo, right, that they need to sell in local, regional, and even global markets, right? Now, enslaved people have this sort of dual relationship with the environment, just like how people like Langston Hughes was mentioned earlier, and other members of the Harlem Renaissance talked about the reality of black people having a double consciousness, right? There's a dual relationship enslaved black people had with the land. One relationship was that they had to do under compunction, right? They had to participate in that extractive relationship to the environment, right? They were compelled to do that by their owners, by their masters, right? But there's another relationship that enslaved people have with the environment, the relationship that they developed in those periods and those moments where they had some degree of autonomy, right? And we'll talk about where some of those moments came in, right? Also want to deal with another set of definitions before diving into some specific instances, and that is the body of knowledge known as traditional ecological knowledge, as well as local ecological knowledge, because this is going to figure into some of the things I have to say about resistance, right? So, what is traditional ecological knowledge? Traditional ecological knowledge is a cumulative body of knowledge, right? Practices, beliefs regarding the relationship of living beings with their environment and each other evolved over centuries by indigenous and local communities, right? It's a place-based system, right? So you get to know the place that you live in, right? And you pass that knowledge down to successive generations, and over time, though that corpus of knowledge that allows people to live within a particular location and to live successfully becomes traditional ecological knowledge, right? So that's knowledge collectively gained over time. Local ecological knowledge, right, is the more dynamic body of observations, practices, and beliefs regarding ecosystems that's gained through direct long-term experience within the environment, right? So if we take our focus on any one given period of time within the centuries-long realm of slavery, then what we see when we look at that period are people that are having a relationship with the land based on handed down traditional ecological knowledge, but their real-time, dynamic and shifting observations of the environment that they were in at that time that we're looking, right? So, let's talk about this image. So this is a reproduction, an attempted reproduction of a slave garden at the Carnton plantation in Tennessee, right? It's not exactly the way it would have looked back when the plantation was in operation, right? Obviously, they wouldn't have had plastic, and certainly this slave garden is built above ground, right? This is largely because Carnton plantation would not allow any digging into the soil, right? So it's an above ground raised bed garden, but it represents what would have been done by enslaved people on that plantation in Tennessee, right? Similar venues can be found like this on plantations in the Amazonian region of Brazil, where I did my study, right? In places like Belém and the Tocantins, right? Around Santarém, right? All of these things have one thing in common: enslaved people had land set aside for them where they could grow things. And this represents a degree of autonomy. This represents a space where they could make some decisions of their own, divorced from the compunctions placed upon them by their slave masters. And so historians that study this do take note of what enslaved people did with the produce of these gardens, right? What did they grow? Because these things are important to know. And how does this fit into a narrative of resistance? Well, it fits within a narrative of resistance because these slave gardens were places where people could resist certain aspects of slavery, right? They could resist the institution itself by selling goods that they grew in these gardens at local markets, right? Sometimes saving up enough money to purchase their freedom or the freedom of loved ones, right? But also just the mere survival, just the mere taking care of one's own health was an act of resistance, right? So slave gardens are necessary because of situations like this. Now, this is an image taken from the site for George Washington's Mount Vernon. If you're not familiar with Mount Vernon, that is the plantation that George Washington, our first president, owned and maintained, right? So why this image? What does this have to do with slave gardens or the environment or resistance? Well, I'll read from here a brief quote, right, from a visitor to Mount Vernon back in 1798, right, shortly before Washington's death, right? This visitor took note of some of the rations that the enslaved were allowed on this plantation. They were allowed, quote, 1 gallon of maize, meaning corn, per week. This makes 1 quart a day, and half as much for the children, with 20 herrings each per month, right? So basically, the daily rations for an enslaved adult working on Mount Vernon that was supplied by the plantation itself, right, equated to about 1 quart of cornmeal and about 5 to 8 ounces of salted fish, usually herring, or if herring wasn't in supply, shad, right? This is not by anyone's standard a meal that fits a full nutritional profile, right? It supplies some carbohydrate, it supplies some protein, right? But does not do what is necessary to really feed and nourish somebody that's expected to do the labor that they would have to do on Mount Vernon. By the same token, in Brazil, right, in the Amazon region where I studied, right, similar rations were handed out. Usually a bit of fish or dried meat. In Brazil, in the Amazon, they would not be providing cornmeal, they would be providing farinha. Farinha is a type of meal made from cassava plant, what they call manioc, right? We call it cassava here, right? So in an effort to add to their diet, right, to really nourish and supply themselves with the things that they needed, enslaved people had to grow in their gardens the things that they wanted to do, right? And so here we have an image at the top, right, of manioc, the cassava root, right? Here at the bottom is Oryza glaberrima, which is the scientific name for what is typically or commonly called black rice, right? Black rice would be one of the more common forms of rice grown in the Americas prior to more standardized milling in large-scale mills, right? Black rice is also notable for being an African-derived plant, right? And so, in the low country of the Carolinas and Georgia, and of course in some of the watery coastal estuaries of Brazil, black rice would be grown, right? And this rice would be grown oftentimes by enslaved people from the west coast of Africa, typically people from the Balanta people, who were familiar with rice growing because they grew this rice and had been growing rice prior to the transatlantic slave trade in West Africa, right? And so this pulls into the use of enslaved people based on their ethnic group and some of their particular valued skills, right? So there's a knowledge there, a traditional knowledge that will be used by enslaved people in the unfortunate circumstances of enslavement in the Americas, right? But this is a knowledge that leads back to Africa itself. Now, manioc implies a knowledge that they would gain after arrival in the Americas, right? Manioc is not, while eaten commonly in Africa now, is not a plant native to Africa, right? It makes its way via the Columbian Exchange during the colonial period, right? It is a plant that is native to the Americas, right? And so what we have here is an encapsulation of the fact that enslaved people are learning new environmental realities. They're learning new aspects of the local ecologies that they're involved in, and they're applying some of the traditional knowledge along the way. So, if having a slave garden and growing supplemental food crops like cassava, like black rice, like cowpeas, what we call black-eyed peas, right, which also originates from Africa, right, and a number of other foods that would have been either European or American in origin to supplement their diets is one use of sustaining one's health and thereby surviving this traumatic experience, and I consider that survival an act of resistance itself, right? On the other end of the spectrum, if you will, we also have the decision sometimes to not allow the continued propagation of people to be fed into this system, right? And so environmental knowledge was used by enslaved people to ensure that they did not give birth to children that would be the next generation of enslaved folks, right? So abortifacients will be one of those plant knowledges that will be passed on, and it's a particularly gendered form of knowledge, right? To touch on what Tomiko was referencing when talking about the use of poison and how that is typically used by women, right? The knowledge of these abortifacients was a particularly gendered form of knowledge passed amongst enslaved women, right, over the process of enslavement throughout the Americas, right? So, some of these abortifacients would include using the bark of the cotton plant, obviously a plant in fair abundance in the American South during the 19th century, right? And also using the peacock flower, right? Tinctures would be made from these plants in an effort to induce a miscarriage, right? But these weren't the only abortifacients that could be put to use. So, for example, read from this quote here. There was a quote, and this comes from the WPA narratives of those still living enslaved people that were interviewed during the New Deal and the Great Depression, right? And this is from a woman by the name of Luli, right? She reports, quote, "In them days, the turpentine was strong and 10 or 12 drops would miscarry you. But the makers found what it was used for, and they changed the way of making turpentine. It ain't no good no more." So we see an active resistance in the use of a product produced on plantations, right, that enslaved women came to know would cause them to miscarry. And if they wished to induce such, they did it using those methods. But here in this quote, we also see that that method was discovered by slave masters, and then there was an input to it by weakening, reducing the strength of the turpentine produced, right, in an effort to keep women from miscarrying. Because if there's one thing that was certain about the enslavement in the 19th century, right, is that once trafficking from Africa began to be restricted by both the British and the Americans, is that there was a dramatic rise in internal trafficking, which meant a greater value put upon successive generations of people born into slavery, right? And yet enslaved people sought to counter that wherever they felt it necessary to do so by falling back upon this sort of environmental knowledge. One other thing that I want to mention here too in terms of herbal knowledge or plant knowledge before moving on to the next environmental section is that in turn, there will be the use of plants that were meant to help heal a person, right? Or help one become well if they had fallen ill, right? And there were multiple uses of plants that were known by a great deal of enslaved people, no matter where in the Atlantic world you found them. And they spoke to that, right? Another source of knowledge about how some of these enslaved people lived and what they knew would be the traveling records of those who went from place to place, right? And in my work, that was very critical, right? The traveling records of naturalists, of botanists, of even businessmen that just had an interest in going to Brazil, right? would produce the kind of information that was just pivotal in sort of outlining the knowledge of enslaved people, right? So, for example, here's a quote from the travels of English naturalist and anthropologist Alfred Russel Wallace, right? He traveled in 1848 to the Amazon region, and he toured the Amazon with an enslaved guide, right? And this guide would point out, as Wallace would say, that he would point out the different plants, and Wallace writes, quote, "This," he would say, "is ocuba, a very good medicine, good for sore throat, and showed us that a watery sap issued freely on the bark being cut. This," said he, referring to his guide, glancing at a magnificent tall straight tree, "is good wood for houses, good for floors. We call it guaruba," right? And so as the guide is leading him around the forest, right, he's pointing out his knowledge of certain plants, right, and what they're good for, right, including a medicinal use for dealing with sore throat, right? Some of the court records in Brazil, some of the church records in Brazil point this out too, right? As particularly young women would be accused of, by the Catholic Church of practicing witchcraft, right? Young indigenous or enslaved African women, and typically when they were accused of so doing, they were practicing some form of herbal medicine or putting together love potions and things like that for as clients for some of the local settlers. So I want to very quickly turn to the sort of last portion of this presentation on environmental history and slavery, right? And one of the more commonly practiced forms of resistance would be running away, right? And certainly slave revolts do get attention because of the amount of violence, right? And the very obvious nature of trying to undo the system of slavery, right? But running away is one of the more common acts of resistance practiced throughout the Americas, right? And when running away, right, that is no mere notion. When looking to run away and escape from slavery, one has to have in mind some type of destination, right? One has to have in mind some type of route, right? One has to have in mind some degree of ecological knowledge that will aid in the successful escape from one place to another, right? So in this, right, historians like Reed and Zimmerman, for example, demonstrate that many of those who successfully ran away from slavery in the colony of Brazil tended to be men, and they tended to be men who worked outdoors, right, as part of their job during the slavery. Why is that? Because they got a very good lay of the land, not only of the plantation itself, but its immediate surroundings, right? There would be a number of enslaved people who were trustees who were allowed to hunt on the grounds surrounding the plantation, who were allowed to fish in those rivers and creeks near the plantation. And many of these people also became some of the more successful escapees, right? If you knew the lay of the land, you had a better chance of getting away, right? So here we have an image, a global look at the location of mangroves throughout the world, right? And we can see that within the Atlantic world itself, right, mangroves are very prominent all along the coast of West and Central Africa, right? And then over in the Americas, we can see them extensively in the southern U.S. and the Caribbean, and notably along the Atlantic coast of Brazil, right? One of the things that I found in my research was that mangroves were places of hiding for a number of runaways from slavery in Brazil, right? But what I also staggered upon is something that I hadn't even considered before doing this research, and that was that mangroves were at times the location for runaways and fugitives in West Africa itself, right? Sometimes we forget to think about the tragedy that was the capture of enslaved people, or the capture of people to be enslaved in West Africa itself, right? And there were groups along the coast of West Africa that hid mangroves from slave traders, right? And by the same token, many of those who would be captured if they dared to escape at all during their time in bondage in Brazil, they would use the mangroves and, of course, moving into the interior, the difficulty of those rivers and I'm thinking of the word in Portuguese. I'm trying to think of the English translation. The tributaries, I think. Yeah, the rivers and the tributaries that flow off of the main rivers, right? They would use as places to hide, right? And so marshlands, swampy places, right? Mangroves, right? These become places to hide from recapture, right? Why is this? Well, because this is a use of the environment as defense, right? These are places that are difficult to traverse, right? And these are places that made it quite difficult for the authorities to move in and recapture people. And so there are, of course, stories throughout the Americas of successful runaway maroon communities in swampy, marshy areas like this, right? In Brazil, there are numerous examples of this in the Northeast, in the Amazon region, right? There are places like this in the Caribbean, right? In the United States, some of you may be familiar with the stories of the Great Dismal Swamp just in Virginia, right? Or you may even be familiar with some of the swampy marshlands around plantations in Louisiana. Here's a map from 1798 of a particular Louisiana plantation near the city of New Orleans. And all of these areas on the outside of the plantation represent marshlands, right? Low-lying, swampy marshlands. And it will be in marshlands like this that you would have runaway communities, right? Maroon societies like the San Malo Society that existed for about 21 years in the late 1700s in Louisiana, right? Here we can see these houses are built right on the swampy marshlands. They're built on stilts in an effort to kind of keep them above the water level, right? Ultimately, what's significant here is that the sort of knowledge of the terrain, right, allows people to escape successfully because they move to places that they can navigate somewhat easily and that are difficult to navigate for their pursuers, right? And so we'll have an example of like San Malo that could exist for 21 years. Probably one of the more notable examples of a self-sustained runaway community for quite some time would be Palmares in Brazil, which stood as an independent community of fugitives for nearly 100 years, right? And of course, there would be the mountain maroons in Jamaica, as well as the maroon communities in Suriname, many of which do exist to this day, right? And their descendants post-slavery are sort of proud of that heritage. And ultimately, runaway communities stand as another sort of archive of that history, right? Because those communities, some of them fell and were sort of raised over, right? But many of these communities still stand and have made that transition from fugitive slave communities to sort of contemporary modern peasant communities in some of the locations in Latin America, right? And so, for example, in Brazil, there is an entire movement right now, a quilombola movement of people that are the descendants of runaway slaves that are trying to lay claim to the land that they have been on since their forefathers ran away from enslavement, right? And so ultimately, what I'm hoping people will take away from this, right, the sort of so what of this, if you will, is that environmental knowledge helped enslaved people to escape the exploitation of slavery in a multitude of ways, right? It allowed them to sustain themselves in the face of what otherwise would have been a sort of malnourishing and degrading diet, right? It allowed enslaved people to be able to treat themselves when sick, right? To sort of support their own dignity as human beings, despite their circumstances, right? to invest themselves into what Charlotte Fett refers to as relational healing, right? A healing of themselves physically and psychologically that was not a concern or investment of slave masters themselves, right? And probably most significantly, it does allow them to be able to run away, to escape, to basically leave the system of slavery altogether. And I'll mention briefly here, it does allow them at times to contest the system itself too, because as I begin to wrap up here, one of the things that's notable about some of these runaway communities is that these are not just people that ran away, established a community, and then just stayed amongst themselves, right? In many instances, right, these communities were disruptive, right? They were disruptive to the system of slavery. Now, their very existence was a problem. It was a threat to the slave system, right? It's certainly not ideal for an enslaved person to see that there can be an existence outside of slavery, right? So their existence was that, but more than that, these runaway communities tended to be active disruptors, right? And in many instances, whether we're talking about Brazil or Suriname or Louisiana, in many of these instances, these fugitives would return to plantations to trade with enslaved people, right? And sometimes to upend the system by setting fire to plantations and otherwise disrupting the slave system, right? And so, in sum, environmental knowledge is an active part of slave resistance, right? And environmental history has to include the history of slavery because that incorporates a number of relationships to the land in several very distinctive and important contexts, right? The extractive context that suits those who ran plantations, but the autonomous use of the environment and the land as a form of resistance by those who were enslaved too. I think that's very significant. That's been sort of the core of my work.
Thank you.
Were excellent today, and I hope that today's presentations gave you a little bit more insight and further confirmation as to the wonderful scholarship that exists here within our faculty at Texas Southern. Those of you who may not have considered majoring or minoring in history before might now be encouraged to do so. We want certainly to answer any questions. I am not the moderator. I would welcome Dr. Esparza, Dr. Meeks, and Dr. Wilson to come up to the front again. And if any of you have questions, we really do want to encourage you to ask them. If you don't have questions though, or after the questions have been asked, I want to encourage you to scan the QR code that I'm going to put on the screen so we can get some feedback from you. And that will help us plan subsequent